Yeah, well, me neither, but then I saw.
Okay, we need to unmute. And then I'll be able to hear you, and then you'll be all systems go.
Thanks, Greg. We'll get started in like 2 minutes. Hi, everyone. Hello. Welcome back. Feels like a long time for whatever reason. Maybe the change in weather or all the things. But thanks for joining us again, coming out to this library. We'll see. We're here at our next meeting as well. And then I just kind of want to hear if this is a good location, or if you want us to kind of switch around. Libraries are also, they book quickly, so try to get those, the next couple booked out for us as well. So just how convenient this is for everybody, where they're coming from, or if it doesn't matter, we're also okay just booking what's available. Oh, come on. You're not gonna work right now. There it goes. So today on our agenda, we're going to go over questions. We have time for questions for anything that was sent ahead of time. And then we're going to go over food systems and water. Alex is going to present on food systems, and Augie is here from our watershed team who will be presenting on water. And then we have an activity. And then we're gonna talk about what's next. These are the last two priority areas. The one we have not covered is innovation and engagement, which we've been trying to kind of bring that along as we've been going through this. So kind of setting the stage for what we have scheduled for our next meeting and then where we go from here. We're almost kind of halfway through this project, which feels a little crazy. We got to start narrowing in on what we think that final deliverable will be and what the community is kind of asking for. So from there, I'm gonna, oh, now it works. Any questions or comments on the information that was sent ahead of time from Alex and Avi? Yeah.
The Treasure Valley Atlas narratives was amazing.
Yeah, that was my first time looking at them.
And they're brand new just today, I think today.
Oh.
They restructured all of them. So what you guys might have seen was the old one. And so I checked them again today because they just redid all of them, like years of work. So it's really cool.
Well, I guess, I don't know, one thing I've been thinking about, because obviously my interest is in food systems and stuff. And I mean, I'm interested in all of it, but one thing I'm noticing is that we have, like with the waste stream, we kind of are looking at this all-encompassing waste stream. With the water, we're looking at all-encompassing water, you know, all the different sectors, water use, where the water is coming from, where the water is going, all of that, like the holistic thing. And I feel like the food systems piece, at least what I saw so far, that is not what we're looking at. And I guess I'm curious about how the city is approaching food systems in a holistic way versus some of these other like water and waste and stuff.
Yeah, I think it is really challenging because the waste and the water, like those are things that are in our municipality, produced and, you know, gotten rid of here. And food, I mean, you can get so big so fast, right? And so I think trying to figure out what we can control and what we can have influence on versus what's in the county or what's outside of our state. I think, yes, it is a very unique priority area. And I think maybe that's a reason why I would say food systems is probably the least focused on out of all the priorities. I was the first person on our team to be hired to focus on it. And it's definitely been a challenge to figure out like, what is a municipal government's role in the food system? So I don't think you're off base at all.
Any other questions or comments before we jump into it? There'll be opportunity, of course, as Alex gives her food systems presentation, but cool. I'll let Alex take it away.
Awesome, thanks. I think I've met all of you, but I'm Alex Brooks. I'm a climate and sustainability coordinator, and on the climate action division, I focus on climate resilience. So the actions that we're taking that don't have a direct emissions reduction, but can have co-benefits and things like that. So food systems is one of those areas. And so when we're talking about food systems in Boise, it's all food that's coming in or going out of our area. And it includes every step along the way. You guys have seen this in the email we sent ahead of time, but it's everything from the production to the distribution to the consumption and to food waste. And along the way, there's lots of detail and minutia like soil health, access to seeds, the greenhouse gas emissions associated with the transportation, and the greenhouse gas emissions associated with the food waste in the landfill, right? So there's lots of details along the way. And like I said, to Casey's point, the city's trying to figure out like, what's our role in all of that? And it's kind of a new piece that we're trying to figure out. So a few data points that I thought were really interesting when we had this conversation is that the food systems contribute 25 to 30% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And like I said, that's usually associated with transportation of food and then the food waste on the end of this cycle that's being released in a landfill. So in Boise, when we do our greenhouse gas emission reporting, we don't pull out food waste as a source. And so it's just included in the other sources like transportation and waste. And then in the US, 30 to 40% of the food produced goes to waste. And so annually, that's 133 billion pounds of food $161 billion equivalency. So I thought those were pretty stark numbers that kind of give you an idea of there's a lot of issues all around this cycle, and we're working to find some potential solutions. Okay. So we're going to zoom into Idaho a little bit. Once we zoom all the way into Boise, the picture becomes a little bit cloudy. I haven't been able to find a lot of local data on urban agriculture, but I looked at Ada County, and so in 1945, we had 430,000 acres of agricultural lands. That was halved by the early 2000s, and then halved again by 2022. So that's pretty staggering. We're losing agricultural land at an increasing rate. And, like I said, it's hard to figure out how much land in Boise is being allocated to agricultural practices, but we do have some strengths when it comes to local ag. We have a really strong farmers market with over 100 vendors, and I think it's 95% of them are food vendors. We have a lot of local food sold at grocery stores, and that's not just places like the Co-op. Like if you go to Fred Meyer, they have signs that say, "I'm local." I would say we have a really strong local foodie scene. So there's a lot of chefs and restaurant owners that really put value on using locally sourced foods. And hello, come on in. There's spots in the middle. You get the spot of honor right up front. And so the restaurant owners, the chefs, and the people that are eating at restaurants are putting a lot of value on locally sourced foods. Yeah.
Yeah, are you defining local food as Idaho food or Ada County?
Usually local food is defined as within 100 miles. That's the definition that I've seen. And so not just Idaho, I would say Oregon as well, and surrounding states. Yeah. But like whenever we get further and further away from where we are, the emissions increase, the resources increase. So as local as possible is great. And then I would say in Boise, there's also a really strong interest in food independence. There's a lot of people that like to grow their own food. They want to know where their food comes from. They want to have control of that. Some of our challenges, like I said, there's definitely a lack of data around the urban agricultural scene. We have quite a few community gardens, but they're all owned by different people. They're in different states of being. There was a recent survey that went out to community gardens in Boise. 11 garden managers answered, and 8 out of 11 of those gardens will need new managers within the next 5 years. And that can be really detrimental to a community garden to lose someone that's owned that garden for a really long time. And so there's issues like that that are coming up where people are changing, if they're working on a community garden or not, and that can really change the scene as well. But I would say our network is strong when it comes to community gardens, but there is not a very organized central network that connects all of our community gardens.
So everyone, what's considered a community garden?
A community garden, there's lots of different types of community gardens in Boise. You're very right. There are ones that sell to market. So Global Gardens would be an example of a community garden that their farmers then sell at the farmers market. There are also community gardens where people are renting a plot and just for their own consumption. And then there's kind of like a range in between that. So it's usually a centralized space that has plots for either rent or loan, and a single person or a couple people are working on each plot and growing the food for different types of, there are also community gardens that grow food and then just donate it. So it's a range, and in Boise, we kind of have a little bit of everything. There are larger community gardens that sell their produce. There are ones that are just, a single person growing for their household. And then, as you all probably understand, in Boise, we have challenges with access to water. You need a lot of water to grow food, and we live in a desert. And so having access to affordable water is definitely a challenge. And then it's becoming more and more of a challenge of having access to affordable land. So a lot of community gardens or urban farmers will lease a property, but that's not super sustainable if you don't know the future of if you're going to be able to continue farming on that property or not. So, okay. So when we created our climate goals in Boise, food systems was developed as a priority. And there's two areas when we talk about the food systems priority: creating a resilient local food system and supporting sustainable agriculture. And those have a lot of overlap. I tried to kind of divide all of the topics into these two areas, but you'll see lots of overlap in the two areas. So when we talk about a resilient local food economy, there are a few things that we can do to do that. So increasing food security. This is if we see a disruption in anywhere in that food cycle, that our community would still have access to healthy, affordable food. So we saw an example of this during COVID. The grocery store shelves were bare and people freaked out. And so during that time, Boise saw a huge increase in people looking for spaces to garden, looking for local farmers, looking for those reliable sources of food. And so we want to make sure that our community is food secure if there were to be more disruptions like that. We would like to see an increase in access to healthy and affordable foods. And so, like I said, we have a really strong farmers market, and even activities like that are growing. The farmers market has a mobile market, which is a refrigerated van that goes around the city to different areas and provides fresh and healthy food to lots of different neighborhoods throughout the week. And then there is a new farmers market opening over on the West Bench in June, which is really exciting. That will open up access to a whole new part of town. And then also we want to increase local food production and consumption. So increasing things like community gardens, local farms, but then also connecting restaurants with those local farmers so that they can be producing and distributing food in their restaurants that's locally sourced. So it was really hard to do this at scale, but I really liked when Catherine did this. I would say all of these actions are positive, right? None of them are negative, but I tried to kind of scale them up. So if you would like to build a resilient local food economy, some good things you can do is buy local at the grocery store and eat at local restaurants. Even better would be shopping at a farmer's market from local farmers, and then eating where locally sourced ingredients are used in restaurants. And then probably the top would be joining a CSA, which is community supported agriculture. It's basically like a subscription you pay for with a farmer. And so you pay for a season and they would provide you with a box of produce every week or every other week. And so it makes sure that the farmer knows how much produce they will be selling. Instead of going to the farmer's market and just hoping people buy, they have kind of a promise of how much food they would be selling in a CSA. And then eating seasonally is a really great step as well. Eating things that are in season right now that are able to be produced here. It's really challenging in Idaho because we do have cold winters. So we don't have the what other places have that don't have a winter to kind of kill off the crops. But here are some potential actions that you could take when it comes to resilient food economy. Okay.
Hey, Alex,
Yes.
question, and I don't know in terms of like scale how important this really is, but considering that like a CSA would have like probably more effective large scale production, would it be like better or best to grow your own stuff at home?
We're going to talk about that in a little bit. I didn't really include that in this category. It'll come up in the sustainable agriculture. I don't know. I don't know if I could even compare those two, because when you're growing your own garden, you might be using more resources per crop versus someone that's able to do it more efficiently on a larger piece of land. But I don't know, Casey, do you have any input on like growing food yourself versus buying into a CSA?
I mean, I think it depends on what's that replacing, right? If it's replacing lawn that's being irrigated, like with city water, then absolutely it would be. Yeah. You would lower your water use by switching to like drip irrigation with irrigation, and there's a lot of different methods that you can use that would like decrease the amount of water you need to use and or increase the amount of food, right? Yeah. But yeah, I mean, like the issue that we're having where everybody's like people are moving, what we want is density.
Yeah.
And so then like how do you what's the solution for not having everybody just have a big old backyard? Mm-hmm. And so then, and I think that's where like community gardens and incubator farms and land that's locked down. And also I wanted to ask about transfer of development rights and whether that's something the city is looking at, where like if we can give incentives for people to create like even higher density living in a certain designated area in exchange for conservation of ag land just a little bit outside of the, you know, and then, so I think there's like a ton of really cool stuff that could happen there.
Yeah.
But as far as like whether.
So it's just like it depends.
It
Like there's
depends. I
so
think it
much give and
depends.
take.
I mean, with
with
everything, there's
Okay.
trade-offs,
Mhm.
right?
And I think that is why it's hard to actually like
Scale
measure.
it.
I would just add too that gardening is a lot of work.
Yeah.
And for people who are, have limits on their time, but they want to eat local fresh produce, the CSA for many people will be more affordable, cash-wise and time-wise,
Mhm.
and much more convenient.
It's also a little bit more reliable.
Mhm.
Home farmers, like we have a
Higher success rate,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, it's very true.
Talk to my husband about squirrels.
Even just understanding what can be grown, like in whatever way, that's why I like this best thing is like, what can we actually, if we wanted to feed ourselves in this area, what can we actually eat in every season? I think just even that level of education is a huge leg up. Because if we don't even know what even we can eat and what to do with the food that we do produce, I mean, like,
I'm gonna get into it.
like if you, sorry, okay.
I really appreciate it. Yeah, but I'm gonna move
That's a
on.
great demonstration program.
Yeah, for sure.
Very cool.
Yeah, and like I said, there's a lot of overlap between these two areas, but I kind of tried to split it up. So we're gonna move on to sustainable agriculture practices. So I split it into supporting urban agriculture, whether that's local smaller farms, community gardens, backyard gardens, reducing emissions related to agriculture. So yes, that's buying locally when possible, but it's also meal planning to reduce your car trips. You're not going to the grocery store every night. And then reducing food waste at home. Meal planning can also help with that. If you know exactly what you're going to be eating, what you're making, there should be less waste going into the garbage. And we talked about the city composting program. And then I think you were getting into this a little bit of learning to preserve food. So even if you're trying to eat seasonally, you can learn how to preserve that food so you can eat those foods out of the season that they're grown in. So I did the good, better, best again for these. So good would be buying from a local farm, putting your food waste in the city compost bin, and learning about food recovery. We have a really amazing organization in Boise called Rolling Tomato. They recover food from places like Starbucks and produce distributors, and then they give it to other organizations that are in need of food. Better would be volunteering at a community garden. There's always weeds that need to be pulled. Yeah, Mark.
Just a minor point, Starbucks no longer.
Oh, they don't?
They've
Okay.
got a different system.
Okay.
Charlie's Produce, number of restaurants.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks. And then meal planning to reduce vehicle trips and food waste. And then best could be, there's lots of trade-offs like we talked about, but growing your own food at your home or a community garden and learning to cook or preserve with food scraps to decrease the food waste. So let's see. Like we talked about, there's lots of potential barriers when we talk about building a resilient food system. So lack of information, people don't know what is even in season. They don't know where to get it. They don't know how to connect with a local farmer. They don't know how to preserve food. They don't know how to make what they buy at the farmer's market. These things cost money, they take time, and they usually take space and some resources. So there are these potential barriers, but this is kind of what we're trying to find. Like, what are the barriers and what could we offer to the community to increase these types of activities? So now, if you guys have any other questions about food systems, we're going to cover both of the priority areas and then do an activity at the end. So any other questions about food systems?
You mentioned that we have cold winters, which we totally do. Do we have any like good greenhouses where you can continue to get local fresh produce through the winter?
Yeah, I think so. Casey might know better. I should just defer to you for this presentation. But yes, and one of my dream projects at the city in the climate action roadmap, it says build a geothermally heated greenhouse.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And many of them, right? We have geothermal water in the city. Like there are so many places where that
Edward's
could work.
greenhouse is
Yeah.
heated by geothermal.
And like Hillside Junior High, it's right across the street. I mean, there's a ton of spots where that could happen for sure.
Yeah.
And there are some farms that do it, like in high tunnels too, not just like Purple Sage Farm, and they're in Middleton, but they sell here, you know, and there are like fresh greens, but also there's a lot of storage crops, and I think that's kind of the more, you know, like potatoes, winter squashes, beets, carrots, onions, garlic, like you don't even need a refrigerator for those, you can just leave them in your garage and they're fine, you know, and so I think that kind of thing is that's what, for those of us who are into the seasonal eating thing, we eat a lot of starch in the winter. And then you like, this time of year, you're like, yeah, now it's like scrape out the inside.
That was a good question.
Is there any discussion for local food systems? This is weird. I'm a landscape architect. I believe in the idea of if you can't beat them, eat them. Eating weeds.
I thought you were gonna say eating bugs. So I mean, we're both weird, I guess. Yeah, I mean, I think there's lots of weeds that are actually edible, and there's definitely a lack of information when it comes to that. There's also discussions about eating bugs, like the Boise Urban Garden School. They started having cooking classes where they were creating, I think it was like crickets or something like that, and they were creating food out of those. So lots of creative opportunities.
Just being thoughtful about like what are our food sources, and like being open-minded for like it could be a lot of different things, and we could do something that restores habitat and improves biodiversity at the same time that we're sourcing food sustainably and lowering those emissions.
I love that, because my husband and I are big dandelion people.
Yes.
Our big concern with being essentially, we call ourselves the urban raccoons. Like the amount of pesticides and herbicides that are in residences. And so like he grew up hunting squirrels and he won't touch our residential things. I think like dandelions are the same way. We don't fertilize, our neighbor fertilizes. How much like are we gonna get cascading effects from that? So it'd be really cool. I'm afraid of my neighbors.
Thank you so much.
I live in my HOA, and we have a lot of green space, a lot of irrigated green space, a lot of green lawn, big water, honestly. And we're taking different measures, looking at different landscaping approaches, but gardening, a communal gardening approach in some areas I think would make sense. And I keep wondering if that's an opportunity for outreach and trying to mobilize more of that engagement. Because one thing with the gardening side is, I think the trade-off, I wouldn't even worry about the trade-offs. I think we grow it locally, closer the better. Most likely you're not gonna cut down the trees. Some people may for their garden. But it also just gets people outside to observe what's going on, and also maybe a little more sympathetic understanding agricultural difficulties, being organic, and how to manage those crops or what you produce, because they come in and you have to do something. So that's one thing I thought on the HOA side, how to work with those collective groups to start doing some pilot areas where, or even in some areas, leasing out if there was some security in it, a plot of land, because a lot of it is very wide open. I understand it's used, but a lot of the recreational activity is very segmented in certain locations, and some areas are very sunny, good irrigation, and actually a good area to have a garden.
Well, it's interesting because like the city does such a good job of like piloting all these like best practices, and so like it seems like even for this like releasing like to HOAs or whomever like landscape architecture projects, like I feel like the landscape architecture grad students do like a kick-ass job of like putting that stuff forward. But I feel like if the city were able to like spread those best practices to people, like that, the uptake on that would be probably really good. And piggybacking on that, I think this will become clearer as we move forward in the whole project, but without fully understanding like what is the deliverable, what is the goal? You know, are we gamifying and making an app so people can tap every time they do something that reduces their carbon footprint? The whole city gets to work together. Fun, wonderful, very expensive. So like, without understanding what the deliverable looks like, and this, again, we will get there. There's just so many wonderful and exciting ideas, and especially understanding what the city can and can't do when we get to that point, like budget constraints, staffing constraints, so that we can design something that is, I mean, on theme, sustainable, you know, not just for the environment, but for city staff to operate.
Okay, we're gonna get to a chance to capture all your feedback on food systems and the activities, so hold on to those thoughts, but we're gonna move on to water. Yes.
Yep, yeah, and audio will come up. I will just say, as a reminder, like, yes, this group ends in December, but I think that's kind of why we're always asking questions of like, and we'll get to this in the activity, what would you like the city to do? What could you do on a neighborhood scale and an individual scale? Because there's opportunities, with the Energize Our Neighborhood programs that you could apply for a $50,000 grant to build a community garden. Like, those are real opportunities that we have funding set aside every year from council that's more on the neighborhood scale. So we'll get to some of those like questions of what could you do individually? What do you want to do at the neighborhood scale? And also like, what do you want the city to do? Because we're also taking notes of like, okay, maybe it is a pilot that we test out to see how that goes. So I will say, keep the ideas coming, because I think that's the whole purpose of this, as well as like, what else do you want the city to do beyond this too?
Yeah.
So
I think when we're asking for feedback, like add those ideas, because we do really take it into account, so.
Cool.
Thank
you guys. Hi, my name's Augie. I am not in front of you either at all. I don't think you guys, I know some faces here. But if you don't know me, I work at the Watershed Education Center, which you all have visited, which is awesome, our new education center. There I do a different thing every single day. So I do our Youth Climate Action Council. I manage all of our temp staff. I do environmental education programs, water, all sorts of fun things. But one of the things that I love to talk about, and my background is in water and water science and water quality and all of those awesome things. And so the Watershed is a really good fit for me professionally. I really love it there. And I'm really happy to be here talking to you guys, because it's like one of my favorite things to do, to talk to our stakeholders and our citizens and all the people that kind of like rely on water. So you guys have some background information. If you don't, no worries. I'm gonna do like a really quick overview of water in the Boise area and in the Treasure Valley, because I think water, along with food, these are some of like the most intimate things that we talk about when we talk about climate action. Water is such a big part of not only our current community, but also the history of the city of Boise. The watershed itself has changed drastically, and those changes are really why we have the city in the way that it exists today, why we have the Treasure Valley the way that it exists today. I think, for me, like water, there's like a lot of memories and a lot of importance and emotion that are tied into water, and I recognize that. So if you do have questions about any of that, let me know, or if you need clarification. I don't have all the answers either. I probably don't have very many of the answers, to be honest. So if you guys want to learn more, go into it. There's so many things that go into this, but I'm going to start from like a very general perspective, talk about climate change and its effects, and then kind of like what are some of our potential next steps. So just a little bit of background, like what the Boise water story is, what the Boise River water story is. About 200 years ago, before we started to really irrigate and dam the Boise River was a free-flowing river. It spread out in its floodplain quite a bit. Rivers naturally really want to move. They want to spread. They want to fill spaces. They want to change. And it was a place where water and resources were coming from the upper Boise River watershed, so the Boise National Forest. It was bringing all of those things, the nutrients, everything down into the floodplain of the Boise River. It was a place where there was a lot of indigenous activity. People were living here. People were moving through the area quite a bit. And then about 200 years ago, a little less than 200 years ago, people started moving into the valley who wanted to change the system. Who wanted to make it more in line with what we would imagine Western culture using a place like the Treasure Valley. And so they started to do things like build irrigation. They started to do things like build dams. In 1902, the federal government passed the Reclamation Act, and that money was put to good use here in the Treasure Valley. And so they built Ararock Reservoir in 1915. It was the tallest concrete dam in the world at the time, which I always think is cool that at one time we had the tallest concrete dam in the world. And then in the 1950s, they built Anderson Ranch, which was the tallest earthfill dam at one time in the world when they built that. So we had some of the tallest dams in the world. Some of the largest investment in water infrastructure in the world at that time was in the Treasure Valley. And so in really kind of taming this river. I think the Bureau of Reclamation, their mission at the time was taming the arid lands of the West so that we could irrigate and grow farms, grow food in these places. And so it very much became a human system. And then, right now we're living in a time when that irrigation system, that agriculture system, is starting to become an urban system. So through the process, we've done like the agriculture thing, and now we're really focusing on the urbanization thing. And I think with water in particular, we kind of have like a three-headed dragon we always talk about when we talk about water. And that is 1, population growth, 2, land use change, and 3, climate change. So those 3 things drive a lot of what is affecting water currently and what will affect water into the future. And I think water is one of those things that, like I said earlier, it has a lot of emotions. There's a lot of interest in water. There's a lot of money in water. There's a lot of, we've done it this way in the past, and we will never not do it a different way in the future. There's a lot of really tough things to get past when you're talking about water changes. But really, we know one of the things that is true, that is certainly going to happen, is that our future requirements of water are going to change, and how we use water are going to change. It's going to have to change. This is a map I really like. If you saw the Treasure Valley Water Atlas, this is in there. But it just kind of shows like Treasure Valley land use change from, this is probably around my childhood where it was very urban, agriculture divide, a lot more agriculture. 2021, you have like the urban spilling into the agriculture areas. And then the best projections we have, obviously, we don't know what's going to happen in 2100, but at the current rate, we're looking at a valley that is very much centered on urban expansion, urbanization. And this obviously has a lot of implications to it. I think it's very much a part of the Boise experience to be in a world of I remember when that was farmland and kind of like that ideology, but it's something that really affects how we perceive our Treasure Valley, how we perceive the area around us, and also how we perceive water, how we interact with water. And so this is a map of our irrigation districts that we have across the Treasure Valley. And we have a massive amount of irrigation districts that are all individual stakeholders that are all managing and allocating water. And then on top of this, we have federal agencies, state agencies, local agencies. We have water users, we have individuals, we have companies, industries, everything that is coming together to use one resource. And so it's a very difficult thing to get everyone to work together on. One of the things that I, focus on a lot with the general public and with climate change is that climate change, we have this water system that's been built up over a really long amount of time, and it's very complicated and it's used for a lot of different things. But that water system is changing. Climate change is forcing that water system to change. And so along with urbanization and these land use changes, the amount of average snowpack that we're getting is changing. It's decreasing in our upper Boise River watershed, where a majority of our water comes from. About 70% of our water comes from that snowpack. It is creating plants that need more water. Yeah.
You use the term average snowpack. What does that mean?
So snow, what we measure water in the upper river watershed in is called snow water equivalency. So that is basically the amount of water that's stored in snowpack. The average snow water equivalency, the best number I have is about 1.3 million acre feet of water that's stored in snow every year.
But average.
So that would be the average.
It's weighed against something. What is the average weighed against? A 10-year period, a 100-year period, a 20-year period?
That as long as we've been measuring snow water equivalency. So I don't know, I can't tell you. I would probably tell you it's in the 50 years. I don't know the whole length of time.
So we're looking at 122% in the Boise Basin. That's over the entire time frame since the 50s.
Since they've been measuring snow water equivalency, yeah. And I don't know if that's the 50s or not. I don't want to say things I don't know. So however long they've been measuring those measurements, that's.
I'm sure it's an average 10-year period. It's a 20-year average.
I think it's as long as they can take these measurements. at those snow tell sites. It's probably gotten more accurate in the last 20, 30 years as like sensing equipment's better, but climate change is also raising temperatures, which create plants that need more water, right? The evapotranspiration demand from plants is higher when temperatures are higher. So more plants need water, less water is returning to the river. It's creating a less predictable water supply. So kind of going back to where we're talking about that snow water equivalency, measuring the amount of water that's in snow is becoming harder, and snow that often would fall in the spring is instead falling in the spring. It's creating more polluted water. So in water quality, when we look at how water reacts to higher temperatures, we know that higher temperatures tend to lead to things like less dissolved oxygen, faster chemical reactions when it is hotter. We know that it tends to lead to things like algae blooms in our slow moving surface water. We also know that when there's less water in a river or a stream, that also leads to decrease in water quality. And so we're seeing a shift in our water quality. And then in a nutshell, kind of one of the things that we know is that our domestic water demand is really increasing, right? It's outpacing our ability to supply water. And our systems that have been built over the last 150, 200 years are built around agriculture, so around a different need and a different use. And all of this is exacerbated by climate change. So it's kind of like the like elephant in the room, right? Is that our water resources are changing, our use of that water is changing. The tools that we are using to deliver and allocate water are not the tools we necessarily need. And it's very expensive to change that. And the system that water delivery is based on is antiquated, and it's really, really hard to change, to talk people out of the doctrine of prior appropriation. So it's, that's like very, I know it's like very doom and gloom, but I don't want you guys to get the idea that I'm doom and gloom about water, because I think we have to understand, first we have to understand the problem, right? We have to know how severe and kind of like the implications of what we're talking about, because water is the reason we live in Boise. It's the reason our community is built the way that it is. But part of what we were talking about earlier, how this is very much a human system that we've designed. That also means we can design a way out of it. And I think there's a lot of hope there. Like my grandma grew up in Boise in the 1930s and the 1940s, and she didn't once swim in the Boise River when she was growing up. And I thought that was crazy. And she was telling me about it, that at that time, slaughterhouses were dumping sewage straight into the water, and it was treated effectively as a dump. And in the 1940s, we built our Lander Street water removal facility, started treating water, we started changing what the Boise River was. And I think that is something that gives me hope that we can do that again, right? We do need to change it, but it is something that needs to happen, right? So some of the things, these are just some things like, what are we doing as like large groups, communities? What is the Boise, the Boise project, right? The Board of Control doing? What are these like, Veolia, all these stakeholders? One is looking into new sources of water. So there's a lot of different things out there. Some people are proposing we pull water from the Snake River and bring it all the way up here. Some people are talking about, I think the lowest hanging fruit would be digging more wells, so more well access with our groundwater resources. We've talked about with the city of Boise using water from our water renewal facilities, so using water that we haven't been using, and that is a great example of water reuse. People are talking about building Anderson Ranch up another 6 feet, so taking a dam, a reservoir, building it higher. Building neighborhoods that have a plan for their water. So instead of letting places build large neighborhoods that don't have a plan, we can require neighborhoods to have a plan for the water. The city has, I think the new zoning requirement is a 50-year plan for new neighborhoods within Boise City. Learning to adapt to new land use. So taking these old systems and retrofitting them, trying to make them work for urban systems, right? So I know I'm dealing, it was like so ironic that I'm giving this presentation and I'm also dealing with like an irrigation lateral in my backyard that's like 90 years old and it's blowing up and the water master doesn't want to do anything about it. That's an example of like a system that needs to change, right? Like we need to figure out how to take this infrastructure that was built for a different purpose and reuse it and repurpose it. From an individual, and emphasize water quality. I think this is another great example of really focusing on what things we're doing that have an impact on the water quality of the Boise River. And then like individually, there's a ton of action to be had when it comes to water. Water conservation actions. One, just working on your own house's irrigation. I won't say like tear out all your grass or anything. That's not my job because we do love grass here in Boise, but like work on your own house's irrigation, right? Figure out ways that you can, if you are having like a grass lawn, there are ways that you can be more efficient with your watering that can make a big difference on how much you're spending on irrigation, also on the health of your lawn in general. Taking care of your soil. So taking care of soil, whether that's in your gardens or under your grass, makes a huge impact on how much water that soil can retain, makes a huge impact on how healthy that soil is. It's a really important thing to do. Getting rid of lawn that is not used and replace it with water-wise landscaping, xeriscaping, gardens are all great things that you can do kind of, you know, like those are bigger actions, but they make a really big impact on how much water we're using as individuals. In terms of water quality, this is probably where I work in more, is because water quality is something that we talk about quite a bit. One of the easiest ways to help water quality in the Boise River is cleaning up after your pets. So if you have dog poop on your yard, pick it up. That's a great way to take action. Joining community science programs and monitoring water quality. If you really want to get into the weeds, I am actually hosting IDH Jewel Master Water Stewards training on May 31st on a Saturday. And so if you're interested in kind of like water quality science, monitoring water quality, contributing to community science, it's a great way to do it. And then monitoring stormwater in your neighborhood is also great, right? If you work on an HOA or if you live in a neighborhood, watching what goes into the storm drains and down storm drains is a great way to help improve the water quality of the Boise River. And so these are just some of the resources. Like I said, if you are interested in that Master Water Stewards program, please follow the link. I'd love to see you there. There's varying levels. If you don't want to pay the fee to do Master Water Stewards, let me know and I can get you probably into the practicum for free so you can come and learn a little bit about those protocols. It's a little more nerdy, so it's like more water quality stuff, but love to see you there. But just some really good resources for just the general public in Boise. If you guys have any questions, I know there's a ton of stuff I just said really, really fast, trying to get through in time, but yeah. If you guys have, yeah, go ahead.
If we were to dig more wells, is there any concern about dropping the water table and causing problems with like our land?
Yeah, so with groundwater, there's obviously always, just like any water resource, right? It's not an infinite amount of groundwater. So yes, the more wells you dig, the lower that water table drops. In terms of like what's the limit of that water table, it really depends on, if we think about how many wells exist and at the depth that they exist at. So Idaho has a domestic exemption for drilling wells, which means that if you're an individual homeowner, you can drill a well and pull out at, I think, up to 13,000 gallons a day for just like general irrigation in your house. Those wells are generally pretty shallow. And so if we drop the water table enough, it'll go below those wells and they won't be able to pull up water. I think that happened on the bench fairly recently, where some of the houses, it was West Bench somewhere, where some of the houses, their wells dried up. And so I think that's kind of the like, how can you pull out groundwater without wells drying up? Additionally, if we think about how water gets into groundwater, most of that comes from inefficient irrigation. And so in the Treasure Valley, like it's weird that we talk about it this way, but the reason why our water table was where it was in the last 60, 70, 80 years was because we irrigated so much, very, very inefficiently. Right? If you flood irrigating, that water is going to go to the water table. It's going to increase your groundwater levels. So we kind of have an inflated groundwater level, and
kind of, and some of those wells that were built in the past were built with the assumption that the water table was at a different level than it actually is. So yes, we have to be considerate of existing wells, I think is like the limit. There's potentially some room, right? There's some space, some ways you could get some more groundwater, definitely.
Is there any concern that there simply isn't going to be enough water to support the number of residents here? We're talking about it needs to be a change, like there's the 3 dams and it flows from the upper basin, lower basin.
Yeah.
I know snowpack's changing, but is there a projection like we're simply gonna run out of water? Or like, and I understand like it's not gonna be agricultural use as much anymore, but presumably like agricultural takes a lot of water. Residents use a lot as well, but maybe not as much, or I don't even know how to think about it.
Yeah, so right now the best numbers I've seen, and this is with the transition from agriculture into urbanization. So we're talking about water that's being transitioned into urbanization. Is we'll have a deficit in around the 2060 range for about 100,000 acre feet a year. So in terms of
And
like,
household uses 1 acre foot. So
I think 1 acre foot is like, yeah, family of 5 for an entire year is like the measure. It's like a good way to visualize it. So 100,000, we'd have a deficit of about 100,000 acre feet per year, which that doesn't mean we're necessarily running out of water, right? I think we would prioritize water. In terms of water rights, if you guys like kind of looked at that primer, what that would mean is that a lot of those junior water rights wouldn't be fulfilled. So you'd have, that's how we have to allocate water. There's no way around it. So even if, I think going back to that idea of people are like, well, couldn't we just pull more water from the Boise River and use it to send to people's houses? Everything in the Boise River is up till you to Star is already allocated. So all of that water, there's no new water rights that are available for allocation. And then downstream from Star, let's say if you pump water from Star to Boise, those would be junior water rights. So any year you're dealing with a drought, you wouldn't be able to allocate that water. So would we run out of water? I don't know, probably not drinking water, right? It probably looks similar to, let's say we had a bad drought and we weren't able to fulfill water rights, drinking water rights. It probably looks similar to things that happened on the Colorado River or in South Africa recently, where there'd be like heavy restrictions on water use. And we'd have to, it would be like driving off a cliff, right? We'd have to figure out how to handle it. So, yeah.
I wonder if you could fact check something for me. I've seen some interesting climate models, and this was like a year ago. I cannot cite this source. But there are a couple of models that I've seen that showed that Boise would actually, like our area of Idaho, would see an increase in the amount of annual precipitation. But my understanding is that it would be an inconvenient increase. So like when it's snow, it would be big storms all at once. When it's rain, it's flooding. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's a very real possibility. But like you said, it's the type of precipitation, right? And so snow, like you have a system that's built to deliver snow melt. Like everything is built around snow melt. The timing of those 3 reservoirs, everything, Lake Lowell, all this stuff is built to deliver snow melt. And so if that snow falls as rain, even if you get more rain in the spring, you guys know we have spring flooding, right? And that's because that system can't keep up with that. So you have to release more water potentially from the dams, and you wouldn't be able to retain that water throughout the late summer, right? And so that would, it's all about timing really, versus the amount of precipitation. I mean, obviously the amount has a big impact, but that's one of the reasons why building Anderson Ranch a little bit higher is considered a solution, because you might be able to retain some more of that precipitation.
I think one of the more interesting things is that obviously with Boise, the biggest issue is that with higher populations, there's an increasing demand for water. But what about in terms of water quality itself? With more people, what concerns does the city have in terms of the quality of fresh water sources? Yeah, I mean that's a huge consideration. I think
really like stormwater runoff in general is probably the biggest source of like that as a non-point source of pollution. That's probably like the biggest thing we have control over and see an impact on in the Boise River as a community. The city itself, like we operate our water renewal facilities, right, which are treating water and putting it back into the Boise River, but we have pretty high level of control on what quality that water is before it goes back into the river. Whereas the more people, the more concrete, the more impermeable layers you have in a city, the more that water is going to potentially have things in it that you don't want to go back into the river. I think the biggest role we have is one, stormwater education. So kind of that's a big part of Partners for Clean Water within the city of Boise. But two, really like figuring out ways to treat stormwater before it goes back into the river. Hyatt Wetlands, if you guys have been to Hyatt Wetlands before, is a great example of having like some sort of biofiltration system that's treating this water before it goes back into the river. But yeah, it's definitely a concern. Like I said, I don't have all the answers right now, but it's something that we're working on pretty diligently. Yeah.
On that upper basin development in terms of mining and logging.
Yeah, again, I don't think, I mean, and this is kind of where water is one of those things that in a lot of ways you have to think about it that we borrow water, right? Like everyone collectively, like people upstream from us and people downstream from us are getting our water, and people upstream from us are sending us our water. In terms of like mining and development, I don't know how much, that's probably more on a state level in terms of the regulatory actions that we could possibly take. There's probably a better answer within our water resources team on if we have any ability to change what people do in the upper basin, but I would hope that they would follow the correct rules and regulations and then make sure that the water they're sending downstream is something that we could use. Yeah, that's a tough question.
And sorry if I missed more detail on this, but wasn't the city planning to like re-inject into the aquifer with the water renewal?
The recycled water program, do you want to talk about it?
Yeah, so it's part of that water reuse we're talking about from the water renewal facilities. So right now, when water leaves the facility, it goes back into the Boise River. Part of like the next phase of planning for the Public Works Department is how do we, instead of putting that water back in the river, is there a way we could reuse that water? And currently, the plans are in motion to take that water and use it for groundwater recharge. Cool. So thinking about like keeping that water table high, especially in places that need it, right? So South Boise.
Okay. I think the most interesting thing that I heard about that is they were able to purify the water so much that when they injected it back into the ground, it was taking in like minerals from the ground. And so it was like so pure that it was like, no, I need more. And so they like decreased the amount of purification they were doing so that it was more to the natural state of the groundwater. Okay, we're gonna move on. Right? Yeah. Okay, thanks, Augie. Thanks so much. Okay, I gave you 2 pieces of paper. We're gonna do 2 different activities. So first we're gonna look at the one that says envision your food shed. So a food shed is another name for a food system. It's the food that's coming in and out of our system. So you're gonna get to be a little creative with this activity, okay? So on the back of this piece of paper, you're gonna draw or write about your ideal household or community through the lens of food systems. So if you choose to draw, please label all the features so we know what your beautiful drawing is. And some questions to consider. What are the key characteristics of an ideal food system? Is it accessible? Is it affordable? Is it sustainable? Is it equitable? What types of food production should be prioritized? How can we ensure equitable access to healthy and local food for all community members? What infrastructure and policies are needed to support the food system that you'll be drawing? And how do we minimize food waste within the food system? And so if you're having trouble getting started, a good thing to think about is like, what are the things that you consume the most in your household? Think about your pantry, what's inside your fridge, where does that come from? Ideally, where would you like it to come from? And then if you finish early before we end, there are some questions for reflection at the bottom too. So on the back of this piece of paper, you can either draw or just describe what would an ideal food system look like either at your household level, or you can go community-wide if you'd like. So we're gonna take 10 minutes to do that, okay?
Okay.
Okay, let's come back together. Does anyone want to share any ideas that they decided to jot down? Yeah. Okay, thanks.
All right, I think it could be really exciting for the city to use the development code to encourage cluster development. I don't know if that's written into the new code.
It did not change from my understanding in the foothills specifically. I believe that stays the same, it has to be clustered. I can confirm with our urban planner who is online, but from my brief knowledge of the zoning code, cluster development in the foothills for sure. In the hillside.
For anyone who doesn't know, and my understanding of cluster development, which may be a little different, is basically if you have a 1 acre lot and the city will only allow you to put 10 houses on it, or say 5 houses, you can give those 5 houses a smaller lot and leave yourself, say, a half acre. That would be insane dimensionally, but math. You can cluster those together and leave yourself a larger area that could be shared for, say, agriculture, park space, rec space, whatever you want. I think that's a big, exciting one. There's a couple areas where the city could definitely incentivize green space in developments or in high density developments requiring there to be shared garden space. I know there are a certain number of amenities that new developments have to have, and making this a low cost amenity could be very appealing to developers. Leveraging public-private partnerships might also be a really cool space. I know in Moscow, there at least used to be an organization that did a lot of what we're talking about, where if you have an apple tree in your backyard, they would spray it in the spring to make sure that the food was edible. And not full of worms. And then in the fall, they'd come back and harvest it. They'd share whatever you wanted with you, and they'd take the rest to the food bank. So there are cool organizations like that that ensure that we can do urban agriculture in a way that benefits everybody, and like paying volunteers in produce. So if there's people that have land and people that want to garden, everybody wins, and the community gets to eat too. Lots of other little notes, but I'll leave those for later.
Thanks.
Yeah. I have a lot of similar stuff, but something else that I put on there was utilizing space under solar panels. So if we have like those big areas.
Agrivoltaics.
Yeah.
So cool.
Put stuff under there, doubling the use of that land. Yeah.
I think like a couple low hanging fruit, I mean, I have tons, but the, one low hanging fruit, I think is to just rethink the development code. So first off, like using city owned land for lease to for-profit farmers, I think is a good shift. And I know like it's a gray area, but I think it works well if there's organization, and it should be a thing that should happen. With that though, like one of the things that Global Gardens deals with is that they can't build what is like industry standard infrastructure on those. Like you can't just build a high tunnel or a decent greenhouse because of the zoning regulations around like you have to get a building permit to build a greenhouse, you know? And I think that those things like caterpillar tunnels and these very low tech ways that farmers they use for season extension and just basic growing stuff that just you kind of have to have at this point is out of reach at the city on the city owned properties. And I think just shifting that rule would be really, really helpful on properties that the city owns. And I also think y'all should make some serious local food purchasing requirements for all city activities, like that, you know, the city itself should be required to buy food from local producers.
Okay.
Also, can we make a levy on the ballot for preserving
She went big. She went really big for the city there.
Okay, we're gonna shift gears now to our other activity. So on your other piece of paper, it says water action prioritization. And we're gonna be collecting both of these. So these are my spot once you leave. So we talked about 4 different categories in ways that we can use water. And so prioritize these 4 categories in your life. List potential actions or additional questions you have under each category. what do you need to do these actions and who would be involved, so like who are the stakeholders? So we have indoor water conservation, which is things like low flow fixtures, behavior changes, eating less meat. Outdoor water conservation, understanding your water sources, meeting your water master, like Augie was talking about, low water landscaping, and rainwater collection. These are just a few examples to give you an idea of like what we're talking about, but there's lots of different examples. Pollution prevention, so that's things like removing leaves from your sewer drain, throwing wipes, don't throw them in the toilet, picking up pet waste, river cleanups, and then advocacy. So like when you buy a fishing license, the money goes to water conservation, touring the water renewal facility, just educating yourself and others. So if you can please prioritize these categories, which ones are most important to you, which ones are not so important, 1 through 4, and then underneath each of them, say, you know, what are potential things you would like to do in that area, even if there's a barrier, what is the barrier, or any questions or more information you need about each of them. Does that make sense?
One being your most important.
One is most important, 4 less important to you.
Yes, that we think is most important
In your life. Like which one are you most likely to take
To
action
do?
in
Oh,
versus
okay.
which one is least
Got it.
important to you?
Okay.
Thanks for the clarification.
It's all.
Oh, don't talk about that. It's
Okay.
been years.
Wrap up your final thoughts on the water worksheet. Anyone want to share how they prioritized or what your top or your bottom was?
There you go.
Do you wanna
Well, I
go?
have a question, so you know.
Okay, I just, mine were disordered in the way they were presented.
Okay.
I really like the idea of plumbing, seeing plumbing rearranged to use water more than once. My husband does collect water from the shower and uses it to flush the toilet. He keeps little jugs, you know, and then he does that. I know the Japanese do that. They have plumbing so that the water from one activity goes to another activity. That seems really smart to me to do. And I also like the idea of, I was just curious about, this is my question. If the city could add a roundup fee to, like, for example, our sewer bill, because I'm paying Viola for my water bill. But if we could have a roundup, a donation that would be dedicated to conservation, that we could just pay when we pay our bill.
That has come up, I think, in the Curbit. I was just doing some strategic planning with that group and they did some focus groups and there was kind of like this roundup option that would go back towards programs or whatever it might be. Cause there is one, I think, right now on your bill that my understanding that goes towards the low income. If you are struggling to pay your bill, that rounds up.
Yeah.
We only have a couple hundred people subscribe to that, to my understanding. I don't think we've done a ton of like communications. That was back when they first started the program. So it's kind of like, oh, maybe we should use that as another opportunity for maybe other things too.
Yeah, I just want another suggestion, and I'll write this down while other people are talking, but we talked about earlier the times that you could be running your appliances and stuff that would be the most energy conservation. And I think if that was just provided, if it came in your bill or something, like a chart, and you could easily see, this is where I live, and this is, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So so that information is just provided to people.
Yeah.
I think that would be really helpful.
Okay, this might be like a bad question, but are there fish ladders on the Boise River?
No.
Only on Snake River dams,
Yeah,
right?
because there's no fish that migrate past the Hell's Canyon dams and snakes, so that we don't have any migrating fish in the Boise River anymore.
Let's get rid of those other dams. Maybe we'll have to put some in.
Okay, anyone else want to share what they?
Oh, yeah, well, I put outdoor water conservation as my priority. I'm also on the board member of my neighborhood HOA. And in our particular neighborhood, the HOA manages all the landscaping, including on the private lots.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so, and then we pay all the water bills and our water bill is huge.
Yeah.
And so we have a lot of interest on our HOA and ripping out quite a bit of the grass, replacing the xeriscaping. And then also spending money on upgrading our irrigation system, but that's the rub on both of those things is it's an upfront cost. Do we increase the dues, or how do we do that? The people aren't. Does the city have any grants or mechanisms that would assist neighborhoods in that kind of thing? Because I heard in the food system, like you said, there was a grant up there.
Yeah, I know, like, the one thing I can think of is like the Energize program. I know that specifically when it comes to HOAs, it's a sticky situation because is that for the entire neighborhood association or is it just for your HOA? So now we're supporting what an HOA probably should be funding the cost for. I know we had an application for a neighborhood that wanted a pathway in their HOA that had become dilapidated. And we weren't really necessarily interested in like fixing your pathway that probably your HOA should be figuring as well. So that's my one caveat. I'm not sure, I can't think of any other grants.
The city of Nampa got a federal grant and they are providing homeowners with an incentive to either put in low water landscaping or replace their irrigation system. And so there are opportunities like that. There's quite a few cities that are doing incentives for low water planting landscaping right now, so that's great.
So Boise should do that.
Put that in your notes. That is
Yeah.
something that's kind of come up a lot, and we'll talk about this of like what the next step is too. As we've been reviewing the feedback from our survey and from all the community conversations and from what you all have given us, a lot of interest in how to xeriscape and or reduce their lawn. Is it incentives? Is it guides? Is it resources? So we'll be kind of digging into that.
I'm sorry, I'm about to, sorry. Did you need to?
Matt had his hand up too.
Also, I had similar thoughts, not HOA, but just mine's outdoor because, I mean, if you look at my water bill, it's all irrigation. So like I can do small things in the home, which I do, but I mean, the number of gallons used in the summer is like 10x in the winter. And so I'm like trying to fix areas, I'm trying to water efficiently at the right times, I'm trying to get quotes for helping me convert part of my lawn, which costs a ton, so it's like
Yeah.
40 grand, like fix something that I really gonna help, I don't know, but those are the things I focus on, because it's by far the biggest water use in our household.
If you're considering removing lawn and replacing it with a lower water use landscape, please consider not just going full xeriscape, which can be very expensive. It's a lot of heavy materials which tend to be high carbon because they have to be shipped. Please consider a native wildflower garden that benefits habitat as well. You don't have to, you don't have to entirely like eliminate all water use to create a benefit. And that's something a lot of our native wildflowers struggle to do well without irrigation here because it's so much hotter in the city. But you can dramatically reduce the amount of irrigation that irrigation water you're using and also create that habitat benefit at the same time. And it can be a lot less expensive. If you get yourself a rock rake and some elbow grease in the fall, you can rake your grass, which will decrease the amount of grass that comes up again in the spring if you like really mess it up, and spread wildflower seeds, which is the least expensive way to landscape. Thanks.
Maybe we have time for one more, Nate, and then we'll.
Yeah, just back on the HOA, the friends and I used to be neighbors, same HOA in Lakewood, and there are these large park areas. Now I look across the different neighborhood associations, would like to know where they are, where the parks are. Because the amount of water that is used in these parks is just amazing, and the amount of waste that goes on, since where there's boulevards and so on, it's incredible. I'm trying to get the HOAs to be proactive about it or on board, because they always look at costs and they've moved into it, so no one wants to absorb the maintenance costs and a fee structure updated. But even support just to keep lawns higher, mow less frequently, or try to change the landscape in some areas, it's just difficult. So somehow the city, not necessarily providing grants, but more assistance. And I do think there's, we have a lot of websites and resources, but just the sheer amount of water needs to be done. It's just the amount of green grass.
In the desert.
Grass.
Okay, thanks.
Just the last minute, if it goes through. Maybe. For some reason that works. There it goes. Okay, so our next meeting, as I mentioned earlier, we went through all 6 of the priority areas. Leave your feedback as we kind of type this all up for us to aggregate all of the data that we have. So we'll be presenting, we'll probably send ahead of time a recap of the community engagement, which includes the survey, the community conversations, and what we've had here. So we'll send that, we'll talk about that at our meeting, and then we're gonna do an activity to really start identifying and narrowing down the final deliverable. One of the key things that we've kind of asked the community and in the survey is what type of barriers are you facing? And if you could name one thing that could be helpful. The way we kind of have it presented is like kind of the top 10 themes essentially that we heard. So we'll kind of talk through that. Our group is gonna help identify what type of activity we get you guys to do that. So that's our work on our end. And then we'll go from there. So once we get through that June meeting, that'll really set up the roadmap. I don't have much planned until we get through that next meeting, and then that'll help kind of guide us where we go from there. Again, I also want to reiterate, as we kind of identify this final deliverable and start working through staff up, start building this, whatever this might look like, there's opportunities for us also to discuss what else you might want to see the city taking action on, which is why it's really important, I think, that we continue to have that conversation as well, is it kind of sparks ideas and innovation for the city too. So any questions on where we're at? The only other thing is, our next meeting is here. Curious about thoughts. The libraries are very easy and accessible for us to book. Easy Tech that the city is up to. Any other thoughts on other locations, or if this one's okay? Downtown and Bound Crossing. Collister's room is kind of small, so it wouldn't be great for this group probably. But our other, and the Hillcrest Library is also great. So all over, just in general, any thoughts?
Downtown would be a little more central.
Okay, yeah, sure. That one books the bus, of course, but yes. Okay, good feedback. Any other thoughts on preference? Doesn't matter.
Libraries are good.
Libraries are great.
Yeah, libraries are good, yeah.
Okay. I wasn't like, I don't know if you all work downtown or not, or if that's what you're seeing. Okay, cool, that's helpful. Thank you all for being here. Enjoy the rest of your Monday, and we'll see you next month. Leave your papers, one of your, this is like table tennis.
And thank you for bringing receipts.
Oh, yeah, I did not bring those. Oh, well, yeah.
What's that? The receipts. Did you bring the seats?
No, those are from the library.
Oh, let's go.
I took some too.
Yeah.
I was like, I need a kid.
Yeah.
Are these